Denzel Washington wanted nothing more than a quiet seat near the back wall, close enough to the exit that nobody would remember his face by morning. His jacket was 3 years old. His shoes had been resoled twice. When the woman at the registration table asked which firm he represented, he said only that he was there in a support capacity, and she wrote him down as staff without looking up again. Nobody in that ballroom on the 41st floor of the Lakeshore Regency knew that the man they'd just filed under staff had once walked into a burning consulate in the dark and walked out carrying two people who were never supposed to make it home. Nobody knew, and Denzel intended to keep it that way. He had promised himself a long time ago in a hospital hallway in Cleveland with his daughter's small hand wrapped around one finger that he was done being the kind of man rooms remembered. Rain moved against the windows in long diagonal streaks, 41 floors above Lakeshore Drive, and the lights of Chicago blurred into something that looked almost like a photograph left out in the wet. Inside, the room was warm and gold, and loud with the particular confidence of people who had never once been told no in a way that mattered. Claire Whitfield stood near the head of the long table, going over her notes one final time, though she'd known them cold for weeks. She was 29 years old and ran a cybersecurity company that had grown faster than anyone in Chicago's investment circles had predicted, and faster than she sometimes let herself believe. Tonight she was closing a partnership that would put Whitfield's secure systems inside the transaction networks of 6 regional banks, and every investor in that room understood exactly how much money sat behind that sentence. She smoothed the front of her browser once, out of habit rather than nerves, and reminded herself that she had built this company from a converted garage in Rogers Park with 2 employees and a server that used to overheat every August. Nobody handed her this. She was not going to let anyone in this room forget that, least of all the man currently making his way toward her with a smile that never seemed to reach anywhere past his teeth. Nathaniel Kessler moved through a room the way certain men move through rooms, as though the air itself had been arranged for his benefit. He was the largest single investor present, worth by most public estimates somewhere north of $600 million, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades learning exactly how to make people feel grateful for his attention. He complimented Claire's slide deck before he had actually looked at it. He touched her elbow when he steered her toward the window, just briefly, just enough to remind the room whose gravity she was currently standing inside. "You've built something remarkable here," he said, in the warm, unhurried voice of a man who had said the exact same sentence to a dozen other founders in a dozen other rooms. "I only worry sometimes that remarkable things need remarkable protection. The kind protection money can't always buy on its own." Claire smiled the way she'd learned to smile at men like Kessler, polite enough to keep the room comfortable, cool enough that he wouldn't mistake it for warmth. She had heard that particular tone before, the one that sounded like concern and functioned like a leash, and she had spent 3 years teaching herself not to flinch at it. Denzel watched the exchange from near the security station by the entrance without appearing to watch anything at all. He had a habit older than he liked to admit of cataloging a room within the first 90 seconds inside it: exits, blind spots, the rhythm of the wait staff, the 2 men by the coat check who were clearly not hotel employees. He noticed Kessler's assistant almost immediately, a lean, quiet young man named Derek Voss, who carried himself like someone perpetually listening for instructions that hadn't arrived yet. He noticed, too, the way Derek's eyes moved to a black aluminum case sitting near the side table, and then away from it too quickly, the particular guilty rhythm of someone checking on something he wasn't supposed to check on. Before the evening properly began, Denzel stepped into the hallway and called Sophie. She was 11, and she answered on the second ring the way she always did, breathless, like she'd been waiting with the phone already in her hand. He told her he'd be home Thursday. He told her the science project could wait until he got back, that baking soda volcanoes had survived worse delays than one father's business trip. His voice softened a way it never did inside rooms like the one behind him, and for 11 seconds he was not a man with a classified file somewhere in a government basement. He was just a dad standing in a hotel corridor promising his kid he'd be home soon. Then he put the phone away, straightened his jacket, and walked back into the gold light and the noise. He'd taken this job through Walter Briggs's 9 days' notice, a favor between two men who had once trusted each other with their lives and now mostly traded in silence and the occasional late-night phone call. Walter hadn't told him much. Secondary security layer, he'd said, "Watch the room, don't get noticed." Denzel had assumed, walking in, that it would be an easy week. Cameras, badge checks, the kind of quiet, boring diligence that let him bank a paycheck without waking up anything from the life he'd buried in Ohio. He hadn't expected Kessler. He hadn't expected the particular, practiced cruelty of a man who had clearly spent years perfecting the art of humiliating people just gently enough that nobody in the room would call it what it was. "And who exactly are you?" Kessler's voice carried easily across the room, pitched just loud enough to draw eyes, light enough to sound like a joke rather than an accusation. He gestured toward Denzel with an open hand, the way a man gestures toward a piece of furniture he's only just noticed. "I only ask because I don't believe I've had the pleasure. Did the hotel send you up to check the projector cables, or are you lost?" A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby cluster of guests, quick and easy, the kind of laughter that cost the people making it nothing at all. Denzel lowered his eyes for exactly as long as it took the laughter to pass, the way a man lets weather pass over stone, and said nothing. "Leave him be, Nathaniel," Claire said, though even she wasn't sure yet why the stranger by the wall had caught her attention. There was something in the stillness of him that didn't match the nervous, competitive energy of everyone else in the room, an economy of movement, like a man who had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of armor. Renee Sullivan, Claire's general counsel, leaned close and murmured that they should be careful, that a deal this size drew all kinds of people who didn't belong in the room, and that unfamiliar faces deserved a second look before they deserved trust. Claire nodded, though her eyes kept drifting back toward the man near the doorway, the one everyone else in the room had already decided wasn't worth a second thought. It was in that exact moment, while the room's attention was still caught on Kessler's joke, that Denzel watched Derek Voss lift the black case from the said table and set down an almost identical one in its place. The motion took under 2 seconds. Nobody else in that room saw it happen at all. The presentation began beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered gold light across the long table. Claire stood and explained, in the calm, precise voice of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment in the shower for 2 weeks straight, how her encryption framework could shield enormous volumes of financial data from interception and theft, trust-engineered layer by layer, she said, not promised in a single handshake. Kessler nodded through most of it, the picture of a supportive partner, but his questions were not really questions. He asked about failure rates that didn't exist. He asked whether a system designed by, in his words, someone so young could really hold up against professional criminal networks. He asked, with a small, regretful smile, whether Whitfield Secure Systems had the institutional maturity to handle the responsibility it was about to be handed. Claire answered every question evenly, refusing to give him the reaction he was fishing for, though Renee's jaw tightened with each new needle. Denzel stood near the back, brought in that morning, also on short notice, by an old contact named Walter Briggs, to quietly oversee a secondary layer of security for the event. A placement nobody in the room understood or questioned, least of all Kessler, who saw only an unremarkable man leaning against the wall. The main display flickered, the projected chart stuttering into static for 2 full seconds before steadying again. Kessler seized the moment instantly. "Well," he said, spreading his hands toward the room, "I suppose that's what happens when you save money on the technical staff." More laughter. Renee frowned, genuinely wondering for a moment whether the odd, quiet man had actually broken something. Claire, though, kept watching him because his face held no embarrassment at all, only a calm, searching focus aimed at a small camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Denzel crouched near the floor panel beneath the table and found what he already suspected he'd find, a small foreign transmitter wired into the signal box near Kessler's own chair, not the hotel's system at all. He disabled it with 2 quiet motions, and the screen steadied within seconds. Kessler's composure slipped, just barely, his eyes narrowing before he smoothed the look away and doubled down instead of backing off. "Tell me," he said, loud enough for the room, "have you ever once sat in a room where deals this size get made?" I've sat in rooms far worse than this one, Denzel said quietly, and something about the flatness of it made Claire look at him a second time, longer than professional curiosity required. Kessler laughed it off, calling him, with real theatrical flourish now, the broke stepfather who'd apparently wandered into a $40 million negotiation by accident. Somewhere beneath his phone on the table, Derek received a message. 4 words, nothing more. Switch to Plan B. Denzel's let the insult about Ohio settle over him without resistance. He had learned long ago, in places far darker than a Chicago ballroom, that being underestimated was not an injury. It was cover. Kessler wasn't finished. He turned it into a performance, walking a slow half-circle around Denzel the way a man circles something he's already decided isn't dangerous. He asked, to general laughter, whether the maintenance union in Ohio paid overtime for standing quietly in expensive rooms. He asked whether Denzel's daughter, and here his voice dropped, almost gentle, almost concerned, the cruelest register he owned, understood that her father spent his nights watching other people build the kind of future she'd probably never see for herself. The room laughed less at that one. Even a few of Kessler's own allies shifted, uncomfortable, though none of them said anything. That was the part that settled into Denzel's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Not the insult itself, but the silence that followed it, 30 people in a gold room deciding, together and without a word, that this was a joke worth letting land. Claire's expression didn't change, but her hand closed slightly tighter around the edge of the podium. Renee looked down at her legal pad and wrote nothing. And Denzel, for the length of exactly 1 breath, allowed himself to remember a hospital room in Cleveland, a ventilator, a promise made to a wife who wasn't going to be there to see her daughter grow up. And then he let it go, the way he'd taught himself to let everything go. Because a man who reacted was a man who got noticed, and a man who got noticed was a man who eventually got found. He said nothing. He simply looked, for one unhurried second, directly at Kessler, and something in that look made even Kessler's easy smile falter for half a beat before he recovered it and turned back to the room. When the presentation ended, the room moved toward the formal signing. The most sensitive material of the entire negotiations sat inside a single encrypted case that never left Claire's side, the very case Derek had already swapped, loaded now with falsified data engineered to surface later and destroy her credibility from the inside. Denzel had seen the swap happen and chosen not to react, wanting to understand the full shape of the scheme before he moved. Out in the hallway, Walter Briggs found him with the recognition of 2 men who shared history neither of them could speak of in public. "Chicago isn't safe for you," Walter said quietly, "not with what's buried under this city. If that old file surfaces again, it frightens people who'd rather it stayed buried." "I didn't come to dig anything up," Denzel told him. "I came to finish a job and go home to my kid." Back inside, Kessler pressed Claire to open the case immediately, in front of every partner in the room, insisting that transparency demanded it before anyone signed a thing. Renee sensed something wrong but had no concrete reason to object. Denzel stepped forward instead and offered to inspect the seal first. Kessler mocked him instantly. What right did a man who fixed cables for a living have to touch a contract worth more than most countries managed in a fiscal year? Claire hesitated, then let him proceed, remembering how effortlessly he'd handled the signal glitch minutes earlier. The seal Denzel found had been altered with extraordinary precision, the kind of tampering that would escape anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. He said nothing about it. He only set the case down and asked mildly why Kessler seemed to be in such a hurry. Kessler, growing impatient with the delay, snatched the case up himself and entered the access code in front of the entire room, certain that whatever surfaced next would end Claire's credibility in front of every partner she needed. Denzel watched his hands on the keypad, the slight tremor beneath the polish, the small flicker of a man more invested in winning than in truth. He thought of Walter's warning in the hallway. He thought of every year he'd spent making sure no door from his old life would ever swing open in front of strangers again. And he understood, with a settling kind of certainty, that some doors do not ask permission before they open. In the seconds before Kessler Soustham reached the final digit of the code, the room seemed to hold something collectively, the way a crowd holds its breath before a magic trick it half suspects is a trick. Claire's fingers had gone white against the edge of the table. Renee had stopped writing entirely, her pen hovering an inch above the legal pad. Somewhere near the back, a caterer paused mid-step with a tray of untouched champagne, sensing the way people sometimes do that something in the air had shifted from business into danger without anyone announcing it. Denzel thought, briefly and without letting it show anywhere on his face, of every room like this one he'd stood in before, rooms where the wrong flicker of an eye had gotten someone killed, rooms where patience had been the only weapon that mattered. He thought of Sophie's science project sitting half-finished on the kitchen table in Cleveland, of the particular ordinary miracle of getting to go home to something so small and so entirely unclassified. He held on to that thought the way another man might hold on to a railing and let the rest of himself go still and unreadable. Kessler opened the case with visible satisfaction, but in the chaos of the earlier inspection, Denzel had quietly shifted its position one more time, and the case now open under the lights belonged instead to an old Federal Archive drive connected to Walter Briggs. The conference display lit automatically with a locked folder stamped at the highest level of classification. Derek's face drained of color. Kessler tried desperately to sever the connection, but the system had already begun projecting fragments of the file across the screen for the entire room to see. Operation Ashwood, the header read, above a grainy photograph of a much younger man, face partly obscured, captured during a hostage rescue involving an arms trafficking cell that had once operated out of this very city. The image was imperfect, blurred at the edges, but the build, the posture, and a small scar along one forearm were unmistakable to anyone who had ever actually looked at the quiet man near the back wall. The room went absolutely silent. Every person who had laughed at Denzel minutes earlier now stared at him with something closer to disbelief. And then Claire's own name surfaced inside the fragmented file, listed among those recovered during an operation that had taken place 14 years earlier, long before Whitfield's secure systems existed, long before she had built anything at all. She had been taken during a kidnapping in this same city when she was barely 19, pulled out of a locked basement on the south side by a stranger whose face she had never clearly seen and whose name she had never learned. Denzel moved to close the case, but the fragments had already spread through the hotel's internal network, visible now on every wall-mounted screen in the room. There was no putting it back. Kessler's mask came apart completely. He grabbed Renee by the arm before anyone could stop him, pulling a weapon from one of his private security detail, forcing Claire toward the table with a demand that she sign over full command of Whitfield's technology to his immediately in front of everyone, or watch her lawyer get hurt. "You have no idea how long I've studied you," he said, and there was no warmth left anywhere in his voice now. "The kidnapping, the therapy you never talk about. I picked this city on purpose, Claire, because I knew exactly what Emery it would drag out of you the second things got hard." He turned toward Denzel next, almost gleeful, "And you, I already know enough about that file to bury you. One phone call, and you're the man who illegally exposed classified material in front of 40 witnesses." Claire stood frozen between two outcomes she could not survive. If she refused, Renee could be hurt. If she signed, technology built to protect millions of ordinary people would fall into the hands of a network with no oversight, no law, and no limit. Somewhere near the doorway, one of the junior partners, a man named Grant Osee, who had laughed loudest at Kessler's jokes 20 minutes earlier, took a half step toward the exit, then stopped, frozen by the sight of the gun and by the sudden, sick understanding that laughing along with a man like Kessler had never made anyone safe from him. His hands shook at his sides. He did not move to help. He did not move to run. He simply stood there, a witness to exactly the kind of silence Denzel recognized from 100 other rooms, the silence of people discovering too late what their comfort had cost someone else. "You could have signed 20 minutes ago, and none of this would be happening," Kessler said to Claire, his voice climbing now, losing the practiced warmth it had carried all evening. "You want to know why I chose this hotel? Why I chose this city? I read the psychiatric file, Claire. I know about the panic attacks you had for 2 years after the basement. I know you still can't stand in a room with the lights fully off. I built this whole evening around the fact that fear makes people compliant, and I was right, wasn't I? Look at you." Renee, held against Kessler's side, let out a small, sharp sound of protest, and Kessler's grip only tightened. Claire's breathing had gone shallow, her eyes fixed somewhere past him, somewhere that wasn't this room at all anymore, and for one terrible second it looked as though he might actually be right about her. Then her eyes found Denzel, and something in his stillness reached her the way a hand reaches into water to steady a person going under. He didn't nod, he didn't move. He simply held her gaze for exactly as long as she needed to remember that she was not 19 anymore, not in that basement anymore, and that the man across from her was not made of anything more than money and fear dressed up as confidence. Denzel did not move recklessly. He read the room instead, the cable running from the compromised drive, the nearest exit, the faint reflections of the room in the glass cabinet just behind Kessler's shoulder. Walter took a shallow cut to the arm, trying to close the distance too fast, which only sharpened the tension pulling tight across the room like wire. Kessler leaned in one final time. "Go ahead and expose that file," he said. "It'll either make the world afraid of you, or it'll bury you completely under everything you spent years trying to forget." "You're right," Denzel said quietly. "It could do both," then, almost gently, "but I have never once failed to protect the person I was sent to protect." Claire understood, watching him hold that room with nothing but his voice, that he was buying time, stretching the moment deliberately, waiting for something already moving quietly beneath the surface of her own systems. Renee understood it half a second later, resting her free hand against a small legal recorder capturing every word being spoken. Kessler pressed her to finish the signature. She lifted the pen. Then she asked one question that made him hesitate for the first time all night. "Are you sure that first case you opened tonight ever actually belonged to me?" Kessler froze. Denzel allowed himself for exactly 1 second the faintest trace of a smile. He had spent the entire evening quietly rearranging 3 separate layers of cases, and the data Kessler believed he was transmitting outward through Dirk's hidden feed was never Whitfield's real technology at all. It was a tracing protocol Claire had designed years earlier, a safeguard she'd built and hoped she would never actually need. Renee exhaled slowly, hands still warm against the recorder, hardly able to believe how close the room had come to losing everything inside it. Claire lowered the pen she had never actually used, hand trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, and looked at Denzel not as a mystery from a sealed file anymore, but simply as the steady presence who had quietly outthought every move made against her all night. "I recognized the scheme the second your assistant swapped the cases," Denzel told her, calm as he'd been all evening. "I let it run because I wanted him to expose himself completely. Fingerprints, recordings, a payment trail no lawyer could argue away later. What he thought he was stealing was never real. It was your own trap." Kessler screamed at Derek to kill the feed. Derek discovered, with a kind of horror that finally looked genuine, that the receiving server on the other end had already been locked down from outside. Walter activated contact with federal partners using the evidence just gathered to request immediate intervention, and a short, brutal scuffle broke out near the server room down the hall. Denzel did not become anyone's action hero in that hallway. He cut the lights, sealed the side door, used sound to pull attention where he wanted it, and had Kessler restrained within seconds using nothing but old, practiced discipline. Renee was freed unharmed. Claire still held an unsigned contract in her hand. Derek tried to run through the service corridor and was caught immediately by Walter, who blocked the passage before he could disappear into it. Kessler, restrained now and furious, still found room for one more taunt that Denzel would never release the file publicly, because doing so would drag his own past back into a spotlight he'd spent years running from. Denzel said nothing to that, because it carried a grain of truth he couldn't argue with. Claire stepped forward instead and told the room plainly that she would testify Denzel had never leaked anything, that Kessler alone had forced open a sealed, protected case in front of witnesses. Renee confirmed the entire sequence had already been recorded through the hotel's own monitoring system. Sirens rose from the street below. Denzel stood quietly in the shadow of the corridor, showing no satisfaction at all, thinking briefly of a small kitchen in Cleveland and a voice on the phone that mattered more to him than anything happening in this building. Weeks later, Nathaniel Kessler stood in a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago, charged with conspiracy, extortion, unlawful access to classified material, and coordination with a financial network operating well outside any legal boundary. The gallery that day held several of the same investors who had laughed along with his jokes back at the Lakeshore Regency, and none of them met his eyes when the marshals walked him in. Derek Voss cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced sentence, handing investigators a detailed trail of Kessler's transactions stretching back years, shell accounts in 3 states, a standing arrangement with the network Hunter had bragged about, and voice recordings that made the prosecution's closing argument almost unnecessary. Grant Osee, the junior partner who had frozen by the doorway that night, testified as well, his voice unsteady on the stand as he described, in painful detail, exactly how ordinary the evening had felt right up until it wasn't, how easy it had been to laugh along, and how ashamed he'd been of that laughter every single day since. On the day of sentencing, Kessler said very little, but when the judge read the final count aloud, something in his expression finally cracked. Not performance this time, not charm, just a man watching, in real time, everything he'd built on other people's fear collapse into a single number on a page. His attorney asked for leniency, citing decades of charitable giving that the prosecution quietly noted had mostly funded galas with his own name printed on the banners. The judge was not moved. Before he was led out of the courtroom for the last time, Kessler turned once, briefly, toward the gallery, searching it for a face he seemed to expect to find there. Claire's, perhaps, or Denzel's, and found neither. He did not ask for forgiveness. He only said quietly to no one in particular that he supposed there had always been a difference between being feared and being respected, and that he had spent his whole life mistaking one for the other. Nobody in the room answered him. Nobody needed to. Whitfield Secure Systems rebuilt its reputation slowly over the following year. Though Claire changed the way she led the company, no longer trusting people by the size of their portfolio or the polish of their suits, Renee stayed on as general counsel, tightening every safeguard, so nothing like that night could ever slip through again. Denzel, once the investigation closed and the classified fragments were resealed by federal order, prepared to slip out quietly, the way he always had, before any of the reporters gathering outside could catch his face. Claire followed him into the hallway and asked why he always disappeared right after he saved someone. "Some people are built to stand in the light," Denzel told her. "I was trained to leave the room before the lights ever come on." "Not this time," Claire said. "This time you don't have to disappear alone." He paused at that, his hand resting against the cool marble of the corridor wall, studying the sentence the way a man studies a truth he hasn't let himself consider in years. Disappearing had always felt less like a choice and more like an old, practiced reflex, something trained into him so deep that staying visible felt almost dangerous. But something steady in her voice made him hesitate before walking away, made him wonder, for the first time in a long while, whether a man could build a life around being seen instead of around being forgotten. Later, on the hotel's rooftop terrace, the rain had finally thinned into a pale mist over the lake. Claire found him there, no longer the calculating executive from the top of the evening, but a woman who finally understood she'd been carrying a debt for 14 years without ever knowing whose name to put on it. She thanked him, really thanked him, for the first time in her life pointed at an actual person instead of an idea. Denzel struggled to accept it, because his entire training had taught him that finishing a job meant vanishing afterward without a trace. Claire told him plainly that he wasn't a file, wasn't a code name, wasn't a ghost. He was a man who'd chosen a long time ago to save her life, even though nobody was ever supposed to know it. Denzel admitted quietly that the operation all those years back had cost him people he cared about, had taught him not to trust powerful structures of any kind, and had left him raising Sophie alone in Ohio, learning how to fix small ordinary things instead of impossible ones, learning how to wake up in the morning without feeling like he was still standing in the middle of a battlefield. Claire didn't push him toward any kind of public recognition. Instead, she offered him a position as an independent security advisor for Whitfield Secure Systems, entirely on his own terms, far from cameras and press releases. He hesitated, afraid his past might once again come looking for the quiet life he'd worked so hard to build. Walter arrived not long after and assured him the file would be properly resealed for good this time, while Kessler faced full prosecution for what he'd done. For the first time, Denzel understood that his past no longer had complete control over what happened next. He took a brief call from home, looked out over the wet skyline, and told Sophie quietly that he'd be back soon, and that this time, maybe, he wasn't running from anything at all. Months later, at O'Hare, during a short return visit, Claire met him not with a contract in her hand, but with a small envelope holding an old photograph recovered from the restored files. In the faded image, a young man stood shielding a younger Claire from the rain, his face still partly hidden, though now, finally, she knew exactly who he was. Denzel studied the photograph for a long moment before slipping it into his jacket pocket. Maybe some memories, he said, don't need to be erased after all. The story closes with him walking through the gate. No longer the man mocked for his quiet manner, no longer entirely the vanished figure from a sealed government file, just a quiet father who had finally reclaimed the right to live an ordinary life. Outside the terminal, the Chicago sky had cleared, the earlier rain giving way to a pale, washed light that made the whole city look almost gentle, almost forgiving. He didn't look back at the skyline that had once held so much of his old life buried underneath it. He thought, instead of the small, familiar sounds waiting for him at home, a kid arguing about bedtime, a kettle on the stove, an ordinary Tuesday with nothing more asked of him than presence. And walking toward his gate, he found that the weight he'd carried for so long had finally, quietly begun to lift. Somewhere behind him, the city would keep rearranging its fortunes and its secrets long after he was gone, but for the first time in a very long time, none of that weight belonged to him anymore.